Hello and welcome to Chapter 9 for Business Ethics. The chapter is called Professions Under the Microscope, where we'll take a lot of what we've learned throughout the semester and apply it to specific industries that have a lot of influence in our culture. In Section 1, we'll look at entrepreneurship and startups. Section 2, the influence of advertising. 3, the insurance industry. And 4, healthcare. So right at the beginning, we get an introduction as to what we might start thinking about in these 4 industries. Some common problems in entrepreneurship are the enormous risks that are undertaken when you begin any sort of startup company. And these risks aren't just for the founders, they're of course for all the investors and for the people who become employees after the core set of founders have established the business. What about advertising? What does it mean to have truth in advertising? What does it mean when advertising companies and corporations have a disproportionate amount of power compared to the people that they're advertising to? When it comes to insurance, we're dealing with inherently risky situations in which, of course, the insurance companies want to make a profit, but they also have to balance it with the hardship that people face when disasters strike. And maybe one of the most challenging ethical places to do business is within healthcare. It raises all sorts of utilitarian questions about the most good for the most people and whether or not the profit motive can ever really maintain this kind of utilitarian viewpoint, or even a human rights viewpoint. Is healthcare a human right? And if so, what does that mean for business within the industry? So first, we're going to take a look at entrepreneurship. And in this section, they want you to learn these things: be able to identify ethical challenges relating to startups, the positive and negative effects of growth in a startup, and the role of the founder or founders in instilling an ethical culture. As always, our slides here often skip to the inset boxes or the images, and we are left to construct some of the core ideas on our own. So this picture is from Hewlett-Packard, which I didn't know the origins of before I became familiar with this textbook. Apparently, it was 1938 where the founders Hewlett and Packard worked on electrical switches and sound oscillators, eventually becoming the company we know today that makes computers. But what does this mean? We always get these origin stories that are baked into the lore of big companies. But what was it really like when they were first forming their association and trying to develop their products or services? First, we get some statistics about how many startups fail, and these are daunting. We get 75% of venture-backed startups fail, and that's based on a Harvard Business School study. And after 5 years, it's 50%, and after 10 years, over 70%. So out of 10 startups, 7 of them fail within 10 years. That's a huge amount of risk. And a lot of people think that they're going to be the outlier. They think that they're going to be the 3 in 10 that make it. But the statistics bear out the fact that it is very likely that you will fail at least once, becoming on your road to hopefully becoming a successful entrepreneur. So what do risks have to do with ethics? Well, especially when you're using investors' money to grow or start your project, there are obviously ethical issues in being the responsible person of someone else's money. When there's such a high risk and you're so likely to lose it all, Everyone needs to be made well aware and take on board these sobering statistics. Another difficult thing can be the specific ethics and personality of the leaders involved. We get an example of, which has been in the book before, I think Uber, where our text says it rivals the potential of the smartphone itself, replacing taxis in every city, in the whole country, in the whole world, is such a huge potential market to provide a service that is incredibly valuable to people. And indeed, we have the valuation of Uber, let's see, in 2017, where it was valued at $70 billion. But slowly over time, the workplace culture leaked, and it turns out that it was a toxic place to be. Not only was there sexism, but there was racism and homophobia and harassment of all different stripes coming down from the very top, the founder himself. Giving us a case study of destructive tendencies that can spread to an entire institution, an entire business, if the leader, him or herself, does not make building an ethical business a priority and instead is a bit more driven by ego and self-importance. And we all know that that can be a stereotype of startup entrepreneurs or CEOs, that they have to be battle-hardened and tough and egotistical and driven and have insane levels of self-confidence to face these gigantic risks and failures that often happen with entrepreneurship. But when there are no checks and balances, this can create an extremely unethical workplace. So the question to think about here is the balance between being driven and being human-centered. Is it possible for startup entrepreneurs to focus more on the latter, the human-centeredness, the creation of a workplace in which people will find fulfilling, successful, and stable careers? Now this asks, what price would you personally pay to pursue being an entrepreneur? Knowing these statistics and knowing the kinds of difficult personalities that you're likely to encounter, not to mention the sacrifice of your personal life that will need to take place, are you willing to pay all of those prices? How long can you put everything else in your life on the back burner and focus only on work? Is it worth it? The example we get is the founder of Kinko's, but I'm going to leave that, of course, to you and to the weekly assignment, as usual. And that goes already to the influence of advertising. So we can go back right here to think about how companies change after the initial startup phase and what that might mean for ethical decision making. So we know, regardless if the founders have implemented an ethical policy, things are going to change once a company becomes more settled, bureaucratic, and successful. Not only are there way more employees and clients and infrastructure, there's a whole different way that you build your supply chain and your interactions with customers once you transition from a small, very driven startup to a large established company. It seems, we learn from sociologists and other studiers of business culture, that once a human institution gets large enough, especially within capitalism, bureaucracy is almost an inevitable occurrence. where you get layers and layers of decision makers, and procedures become more rigid, less flexible, and more people that get added to the company don't necessarily resonate with the original mission of the startup, whether that is how products and services are built, sold, and delivered, and what the core values of the company happen to be. We get the example of a core value being absolute dedication and honesty to the customer base. This is something that was important to this theoretical company, this theoretical startup. But then you imagine after these procedures of being thoroughly helpful and honest with clients have been baked in to the system, you add 10, 20, 100, 1,000 more employees, and that message might get diluted. Your ethical choices for your own company are something that is key for you to maintain within the transition from entrepreneurial culture to more established business culture. And right in the section with entrepreneurial culture, we get some of these key ethical questions codified and written down in a list. Yeah, you have to deal with the charismatic, driven founders that might be egotistical and have harmful patterns of behavior. And we do want to question if, and this is a quote from the book, entrepreneurs can still succeed if they embraced a humanistic leadership at the outset, or would this invariably undermine the already low initial odds of success? Then we will move on to advertising. This section wants you to learn how social media has altered the advertising landscape, explain the influence of advertising on customers, and analyze the potential for subliminal advertising, which may be a little less central to the point, but it's still a thing we can think about. So, of course, traditional ads in print media, in movies, on television, have shifted rapidly and drastically and the advent of the internet into every part of our lives. We get a quote from a digital marketing consultant, Kelly Jensen, where she says, or they say, the internet is arguably the single most influential factor of our culture, transforming the way we view communication, relationships, and even ourselves. Social media platforms have evolved to symbolize the status of both individuals and businesses alike. Today, using social media to create brand awareness, drive revenue, engage current customers, and attract new ones isn't optional anymore. It's an absolute must. They go on to talk about how, for Gen Z, this is the only way to reach them with advertising in many instances. And even in the case of a vast majority of millennials, they just don't notice ads outside of social media, which is such a big part of so many people's days. So how has advertising changed with social media? Of course, it's more ubiquitous. It's everywhere. How many ads do you think that you see day in and day out on your phone or on any other electronic internet connected devices that you have? It's at least dozens for most of us. And it's a lot harder to regulate the rules that we have about harmful advertising content, about honesty in advertisement, and frankly, just the repetitive nature of seeing ads so frequently influences human psychology in ways that we only are beginning to understand. One thing I don't think our book emphasizes enough is just that. They talk about the elderly or children or developmentally disabled individuals being unduly influenced by ads that are only barely accurate and may actually involve harmful products. like perhaps supplement industries. But it fails to talk about how human psychology is rife with cognitive biases and traps that everyone falls into. You can look up things like the recency effect, wherein the information that you are most recently presented with is the freshest in your mind, and that is the information that you will apply to a problem that occurs in the same time space as learning something very recently, even if what you learned recently isn't accurate or it's only a small part of the picture. We all have these cognitive biases. We are all worn down through repetition. And when ads can reach us on our deepest connected devices to us dozens of times a day, it's going to have an influence even if we are skeptical and intelligent consumers. This is all about unnecessary or, again, potentially harmful purchases. We all buy a ton of stuff that we don't necessarily strictly need. And we're not making a value judgment about that, but we can go on to think about what advertisers might owe to their consumer base when the advertising is so persuasive that it pushes customers to buy so many things that they don't need that they aren't as well able to meet their own basic needs. Furthermore, in things like fast food, you're purchasing something that can be actively harmful. So the two questions that our book wants you to think about is it okay for businesses to just follow the law to the letter and not outright lie? Or is there an ethical standard that is higher that they should be held to? A second ethical question, they say, quote, how we should expect reasonable people to respond to an avalanche of marketing schemes deliberately intended to separate them from their hard-earned cash. And here's where I wanted them to go even more in depth. Again, you can think about how corporations and advertisers have so much more power than any individual consumer. They have teams of lobbyists. They have teams of lawyers. There are these constant ads that I mentioned. Of course, they have way more money than any individual consumer could ever hope to have. They can dominate the news cycle. They try to sometimes unethically bribe politicians. They have infrastructure and procedure and agency that is baked into years of operation, while you, as a single individual consumer, only have your own savviness to fall back on. Sometimes consumer advocacy groups band together and try to fight against this, but the question remains, how do we balance the freedom of the advertising industry to create ads that help them profit with the very significant downsides for the average consumer that often come into play, especially when there are psychological tools that advertisers use to make you feel bad about yourself if you don't buy the product. That's already the end there. The last section is subliminal advertising. The consensus is that it doesn't really exist with current technology, but that it's possible in the future. So there were many scares about it, like the traditional classic one was going to the movies and they'd have words or pictures of popcorn or soda, or the words hungry and thirsty flashed with one frame in the movie, and people would get up and go purchase more food and sodas. But those claims have mostly been debunked. What can happen are these psychological tools wherein if you are exposed to something, you're more likely to go ahead and purchase it. Or if you're anchored, there's another cognitive bias that's built into everyone's psychology. It's just the way our brains work, where if a salesperson or an advertiser gives you a number. So say you walked into a car dealership and you're looking at a car you like, and they say, oh, this is $75,000. And you balk at the price and you say, oh, I'm not paying for that. You will still stay within 10,000 or give or take, that's not an exact number, of 75,000 when you give your counter offer, because our brains get anchored by concrete numbers. There was a classic study about numbers of countries in Africa, where some people were just asked to guess or say how many countries they thought were on the African continent, and guesses ranged all over the place. Then there were some people who got the question when they did the study, are there more or fewer than 45 countries in Africa? And then other people got, are there more or fewer than 100 countries in Africa? And the people who were given specific numbers tended to stick right around the numbers that they were given, even if they were knowledgeable people about geography specifically. So even though subliminal advertising might not be real at the moment, we are certainly susceptible to all sorts of biases that are strong ethical issues within advertising. Should we governmentally regulate it, or should we encourage businesses to self-regulate? Some combination of the two. I'm going to try to only have 2 videos this week, so we're going to go a little bit longer and talk about the insurance industry. This section, they want you to know whether the underlying total business structure of the insurance industry is ethical in and of itself. Think about why the government might offer certain kinds of insurance, and discussing the ethical issues in insurers' decision on whether or not to offer disaster insurance, and learn about and think about the ethical implications of redlining. So the idea of hedging your bets and trying to get some kind of compensation if a risky choice you are making fails is a very old one. Probably even happened all the way back pre-written history. But the insurance industry, the way we are familiar with it in contemporary society, originated when shipping routes started to open up for the first time in the 1600s. So you would have trading ships going all over the world on the oceans, trying to bring back goods from, at the time, exotic places, spices and textiles, and different food products that people had never seen. And as you might imagine, this was a very risky industry. These ships sank and lost cargo all the time. So the company now known as Lloyd's of London was founded around this time, as well as many other big name insurance companies that we would be somewhat familiar with if we heard their names today. Now, how does this work? The insurance company takes premiums. They take a payment periodically and hope against hope that nothing goes wrong, so those premiums are fully their profit. But if something does go wrong and you have a written insurance policy, you make a claim, and thus out of the pool of their profit, the claims are paid. So we're moving into something that is very obviously an ethical issue, because this is loss, human loss, in which if you lost all of the things that you invested in, you might be broke and no longer able to participate in society or meet your very basic needs. There are many people who argue that basic needs are a human right and not a commodity. That's access to food, clean water, clean air, shelter. And recently, people are even arguing more that healthcare and housing and schooling is a basic right in our country, but it wasn't always. And if you dig a little bit deeper and wonder why that they would argue that these are basic human rights, it comes down to respect for human dignity, number one. Everyone should be able to pursue their own goals in life, which relies on a more fundamental principle that we are all morally equal. We're not equal in luck, in what we inherited from where we were born, in skills or abilities, but we are all human beings, and we should all have the opportunity to choose a life and pursue it if we can. And if the world is set up such that we can't, meaning the poor people don't have access to food or water or shelter or education or health care, then you don't even have the opportunity to build yourself a nice life. And a lot of people don't think that that's equality. And if insurance is predatory, well, then it is making things less equal, giving people less opportunities to live the best life that they possibly can. This is not saying that people don't have individual responsibilities to build up their own skills if possible, but it's saying if it's not possible, that's what's not fair. Okay, we're going to skip this one again. It asks you to imagine that you are a small apparel manufacturer and the ethical issues that you are facing with insurance. And this is probably going to be part of your assignment, so we're going to move right on. Okay, so with climate change, but also in general, when there's an area that is prone to a particular kind of disaster, like earthquakes in California, or floods in the southeast with all of the hurricanes, or fires, then over time, insurance companies are less likely to offer policies in those areas because they're not making any profit. They take all the premiums, an entire region is flooded, and then they have to pay out thousands or hundreds of thousands of claims. And such private companies driven by the profit motive say, okay, well, we're going to close up shop and we are going to go to a place that is less prone to these kinds of natural disasters. But then what happens to the people in those areas who lose everything? And this is where we get government subsidized or created insurance. FEMA runs the National Flood Insurance Program. California runs or is trying to run an insurance program that protects against fires and earthquakes. And though the United States is mostly, our insurance is privately run, owned, and operated, in other countries there are parallels in which, when human rights interests come to play, they use taxpayer dollars to insure people even within these high-risk areas. And questions our book wants you to think about is whether that should be more the model for insurance across the industry and less profit directed. Because again, those ethical questions of being able to live a good life come into play. Oh, shoot. Huh. Well, that went full screen. And it went back to an old slide. So I will wrap this first video up by mentioning redlining briefly, and then we can move on to the second video. Redlining is an historical practice in the United States where insurance companies would actually use a red pen on a map and outline neighborhoods that they would not insure. And these neighborhoods were almost all, if not universally, minority neighborhoods. especially in inner cities. And redlining was not just in the insurance industry, it was in the housing industry and the healthcare industry. And insurance companies don't admit this. They say they offer higher policies or no policies at all because they can't make a profit in those neighborhoods. There are higher numbers of claims, there are higher numbers of accidents, and that's the reason that they won't go into these neighborhoods, or they charge way more money, even for people who have similar risk. So like if you give car insurance out, you generally get tiered up depending on how many accidents you've had. But they compared minority neighborhoods and predominantly white neighborhoods, drivers that had the same accident records. The minority people still had much higher premiums. The United States bans this, but it's hard to prove that it is solely or predominantly based on race. So that is the end of part 1. I will see you in part 2.